Ms Carey, as you know, today is the 20th anniversary of the bombings on the 7th of July 2005. 52 people died, hundreds were severely injured, and many thousands more were traumatised. I presided over the inquests into the deaths of the 52 victims. The anniversary we marked in various ways across London. I won't be taking part in them because of the importance I placed on progressing this inquiry and this module in particular. But I'm sure our thoughts and prayers are with all those who suffered and are still suffering as a result of the 4 bombs.
Lady, they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I hand over to Mr. Beach, please?
Mr. Beach.
Yes, good morning, my lady. May we please call Miss Mary Cridge?
Stand, please, and take the and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
You've provided 2 very helpful witness statements to the inquiry already. And just in your statements then, you set out that you have been with the Care Quality Commissioner, CQC, as the Director of Adult Social Care since July 2022. And before that, during the first waves of the pandemic, you were the Interim Deputy Chief Inspector for Adult Social Care. Is that correct?
Yes, I was one of 3 Deputy Chief Inspectors reporting to the Chief Inspector at that time.
And you're the first, I think, witness in this inquiry to give evidence on behalf of the CQC, and I understand you just wish to make a very brief reflection on that.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to take the opportunity on behalf of CQC to express our deep sympathy to all those who lost loved ones, relatives and friends during the pandemic, and to emphasise our huge thanks and gratitude to all those who worked in health and care and the supporting services at the time. Thank you.
Thank you. You state in your statement that the CQC's objective is to make sure health and social services provide people with safe, effective, compassionate, high-quality care. And you set out that the CQC's responsibilities include registration, monitoring, inspection, assessment and regulation of services.
Yes.
At the risk of grossly oversimplifying, if we add in taking enforcement action, is that a broad summary of what regulation encompasses?
Yes, it is.
And just very briefly, why is it important that the CQC regulates adult social care?
It's important to have a set of standards that we can all expect to be, that health and care is delivered to, so that those commissioning care, those providing care, and most importantly, those receiving care, know what they can expect and what good care looks like.
And regulation provides both assurance to the government, to central government, and the public about the safety and quality of those services. Is that
Yes.
fair? Thank you. The CQC also then regulates a variety of regulated activities, but for the purposes of this module, it's fair to say that care homes, both with and without nursing support, and domiciliary care services fall within CQC's regulatory remit.
Yes, they do.
And then if we took a snapshot at the 1st of January 2020, there were some 15,525 adult care homes registered at the CQC and some 9,415 domiciliary care providers.
Yes.
Thank you. And just at the outset then, so if we take that snapshot as the 1st of January 2020, what matters were the regulator concerned about the sector generally? In a state of care report for the year 2019-20, it was noted that there was continued fragility of the adult social care provision. What was concerning the CQC?
Well, the social care has had, at that time, had a number of challenges. And the market was fragile. It's important to understand it is a market made up of independent providers, a mix of profit and not-for-profit, from the very small to the very large and all points in between. And that's the strength, the diversity of the sector. But staffing, pressures on staffing, funding, paying for care, the competition that there are for workers, so access to care and quality of care. There were a lot of challenges that the sector were facing pre-pandemic.
You mentioned there quality of care, and I would like to spend a bit of time this morning exploring one of the mechanisms CQC would use to assess or regulate that in the form of regulatory inspections. In your statement, you do set out in quite a bit of detail about the various processes, about the various stages of inspections, that they can be comprehensive or focused on a specific issue, and that they involve collection from the providers, reviews of notifications, followed by the actual on-site inspection and a report. Again, at risk of grossly oversimplifying, is that a fair summary of what the inspection process would involve?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And if we could please have on the screen then your statement at INQ 584245. It's page 68, paragraph 203. And at this point of your statement, you set out the time frames for inspections of adult social care services. And it's not a straight time frame. It depends on previous inspections and outcomes. Is that right?
Yes, these we refer to as our sort of frequency rules and set the sort of general timescales, but there has always been a place for responsive inspections, so we would go sooner than this if we had intelligence of risk, of harm, whether we'd had whistleblowing and so forth. But this is the general sort of framework at the time.
Are these timeframes set out in statute, or is this a CQC policy?
I'd have to confirm to you exactly the basis of it. I think it is an understood expectation, possibly discussed with the department, but we can confirm that point to you.
And prior to the outbreak of the pandemic then, was the CQC consistently hitting these targets of inspecting within 30 months, 12 months, 18 months as required?
I would say generally there were always the unexpected risk would take priority. So it was a large inspection programme ongoing, but generally this is what happened.
And then if I could just refer to your supplementary statement to paragraph 41, you set out that the CQC recognises that on-site inspections are an integral part of regulation, and at paragraph 42 that they play a vital role in assuring safety and quality of services. And why does the CQC consider that on-site inspections play such a vital role?
Well, there is something about seeing the place where care is being experienced and delivered. There are the sights, the sounds, the smells, frankly. And it's an opportunity to observe care being delivered, to get a sense of the place, of the atmosphere, to observe the interactions between staff and those receiving care, and to have a chance to sit and talk to people. So it is a really important part of regulation.
And would there be any suggestion on the part of CQC that inspections are in fact normally just box-ticking exercises of little or no merit?
I don't recognise that description of inspections. Of course, we have a framework underpinned by the regulations that set out the standards of fundamental care, the fundamental standards that are required. We have to have a framework. We have to have criteria by which we make our judgments, because we do aim for, of course, for consistency of judgment. But an inspection is based on intelligence about what we already know, about what people using the service say, and engaging with people and getting feedback from those in the service, from people working there, from their partners. It's a rich tapestry of information, certainly not a box-ticking exercise.
Thank you. I'm now going to take you to the relevant period where there was a decision to suspend inspections. You do set out at paragraph 217 of your witness statement that before the pandemic, we had already considered pausing some routine inspection activity. albeit for short periods of time. So there had been occasions in the past then where CQC had taken such steps.
In healthcare, yes, not social care. During a particularly bad winter, we temporarily, for a matter of, I think, 4 weeks, paused inspections of urgent care ambulance trusts and a sort of A&E departments, but for social care. So CQC had paused inspections before.
Thank you. And is there any reason why it was never deployed in adult social care?
Well, we hadn't had the circumstances that would require it. The pandemic was an unprecedented situation. So yes, we hadn't done it before that.
Thank you. Well, if we perhaps now just take a look at that decision. If I could please have on the screen INQ 398833, please. And there's a very helpful heading halfway down entitled Routine Inspections to Cease. First of all, was this a CQC decision or was it a Department of Health decision? Was CQC the decision maker?
CQC was the decision maker. The decision was taken by our Gold Command.
And could you just briefly outline what factors led CQC to determine on the 16th of March that there's to be a ceasing of routine inspections?
Yes, it was routine inspections, not all inspections. We were concerned to assess the situation, support the sector, and allow providers to concentrate on their own delivery of care. We wanted to focus on risk, on where we could make the most difference in these circumstances, and also to protect and safeguard our own staff. We didn't want to be unwittingly spreading the virus through inspection.
You said there was a focus on risk. Was there an acknowledgement at that stage in the CQC that adult social care settings posed a particular risk?
All care settings pose a risk. What changed at that stage was the level of risk that triggered activity. So in April, we had the test of extreme risk. The other factor was, at that stage, we didn't have any access to PPE. So that was another consideration.
I'll come on to explore issues about testing and PPE and inspectors in due course. At paragraph 231 of your statement then, you set out that in the early stages of the pandemic, and you specifically in the healthcare sector, there was mounting pressure from government, external organisations and the public for CQC to suspend routine inspections. Was there any similar pressure to suspend routine inspections in adult social care?
I don't know, reflecting back, if I could distinguish between the pressure in the health setting and social care. I recall the pressure was, the question was whether we should stop inspecting. I think there was a sense that it might be a distraction, get in the way and so on. And this is in the early days when we were all still finding our feet.
And you go on then to describe in your statement, and this is paragraph 218, that before the 16th of March, and you say, at the start of the pandemic, prior to suspending routine inspections, we cancelled a number of routine inspections and directed our activities at areas which were considered to have the most risk. We considered that there were some environments, such as social care settings, domiciliary care, which presented inherently more risk in terms of opportunities for people to suffer from unseen harm, and that they would therefore need to be monitored carefully. So before the 16th of March, there was an acknowledgement that some inspections would have to cease, but inspections in adult social care would have to continue. Was that not a perfectly proportionate approach which could or should have continued ongoing in the pandemic?
Well, we wanted to inspect as soon as we could do so safely and to target the areas of risk. Take into account the three factors that we've already referred to, and we had the level of extreme risk. So, yes, we did want to be able to continue, and we did, of course, restart in-person inspections once we had access to PPE, and the numbers of those inspections grew from May onwards.
To what extent did the need for oversight of these vulnerable or more at-risk settings play a part? What balance did CQC ascribe the need to continue oversight or monitoring of adult social care when making these decisions?
Well, that's right. It wasn't all about inspection, and it's never been all about inspection. We've always been gathered and have received intelligence to help us inform our decisions about what we do, where we do it, and when. But there was live discussion at the time about what we could do instead when we weren't undertaking routine inspections. And throughout the months that followed, we devised a number of different ways to undertake contact with services and monitoring of them.
And I will come back to that also in due course, Ms. Cridge. But just let me ask you then, the intent was obviously to reduce footfall and to protect the homes, but would the risk of a solitary inspector or a relatively small inspection team going into a care home with PPE and testing, could that not have adequately dealt with those concerns and ensured that inspections could continue in a more routine manner?
Well, yes. I mean, testing throughout 2020, CQC had the same access to testing as the general public. We were seeking access to testing from about July onwards. And had we had stocks of PPE and the same testing as available to health services, that would be my hope for the future, that in future we could take a different tack because we would have the wherewithal to continue in the way that we didn't have in March, April 2020.
There was extensive correspondence between the department and CQC on the issue of testing, and I think it takes until December for regular asymptomatic testing to be put in place.
Yes.
On the issue of PPE, when do you consider that the CQC had ample PPE in place to be able to conduct a meaningful?
Okay, so like many organisations, we were scrambling to get hold of PPE. I think it was the 28th of April, certainly late April, that we had a stock of PPE in our Newcastle office. But getting hold of it was a challenge. At that stage, there was great demand on courier services, and it could take 5 or 6 days to get the PPE from the office to the inspector. But supplies eased and processes got easier as we went on, and it was something by the autumn that inspectors could order in the same way they'd order stationery, and the delivery was much quicker.
So if I may return then to perhaps the proposition underlying my question, had there been testing and PPE available in March 2020, would it have been necessary for the CQC to make this decision?
I think my personal view is that a different decision would have been made if we could have continued safely wearing PPE, observing infection control procedures. I think it would have been different.
Okay. Just moving on, you've mentioned a couple of times already this morning the threshold, if I may use that terminology, of extreme risk. And last week, the inquiry will have seen a series of messages between the then Chief Executive and the then Secretary of State for the Home Department. I don't think we need the actual text on screen, but if we could have your statement at INQ 584245, page 84, paragraph 256, please. In this exchange, you set out what within those texts the Secretary of State's request to pull back more than they are currently planning on inspection and data collection. And the response from the CQC chair was then, we already have pulled right back on inspections, only where we believe abuse or serious harm may be happening. How was the CQC to get that information about abuse or serious harm in the absence of, as you say, being the eyes and ears of getting in and smelling the place?
Well, actually, it isn't usually a routine inspection that flags up abuse and harm. we receive a great deal of information. People proactively contact CQC. We have our customer contact centre, and we have there's a place on our website where people can contact us. We've got a process called Give Feedback and Care for people and their relatives to complete. And we have contact from staff in services. And during this time, we saw a huge increase in the amount of contact from both the public and from people working in services. 50% increase from the public, 55% from people working in services. Over the course of the pandemic, we had some 2.5 million contacts, so we weren't short of information. That sort of intelligence informed where we went when we got out in May. And in most of those early inspections, we did indeed find serious issues and took immediate action. So that's how we got that information, through people contacting us.
And if I could return then almost to that's how you got the information. If I could return to the threshold applied of, if you've said extreme risk, as it says there, where we believe abuse or serious harm may be happening. On reflection, was that threshold too high in a scenario where you're relying on whistleblowing or safeguarding or contacts with care homes, and in the absence of being there, was the threshold of only where you believe there was abuse or serious harm too high to ultimately end up going into care homes to see what was happening?
Well, the extreme risk was lowered, and we had a separate process to make decisions. It wasn't a case of we're not going to inspect so nothing happens. We wouldn't leave the service like that. So we'd be in contact usually with the local authority, who often are the commissioners of the service, and we would do what we could to help. There was a lot of sort of practical help going on in those early days. I know we're going to come on to talk about the monitoring, but of course we were talking to services themselves during this time, so it wasn't a case of we're concerned and do nothing. It was a case of we're concerned, does it meet that threshold for us to go out, and if it doesn't, who else can help, what can happen in the meantime?
And just then, on reflection, do you consider the decision to pull right back on inspections, as expressed here by the Chief Executive, was likely or could have the potential for exposing vulnerable service users to harm?
Well, as I've said, the history of routine inspections is they're very valuable and we get a lot of information, but that is not usually where the most problematic information is found. People put on a good front for an inspection, whereas the intelligence that comes to us by what people experiencing that service tell us and their families, that is invaluable. It points us where to look. But I would say that, as you've prompted me to say, if we had our time again with the PPE in place, we could have continued in a different way from that which we were able in April 2020.
Thank you. If we could move on and perhaps move back to INQ 003988833. And just, you state there, in adult social care, in the absence of a single national oversight body, CQC will act as a support for registered managers. Our inspection team will be there to produce advice, guidance to the providers throughout this period. First of all, you note the absence of a single national oversight body. First question is that the CQC? And second question is, if it's not, who should it be?
Well, we aren't the single national oversight body in the sense and in the same way that NHS England were and are for the NHS, in that we don't direct the services, don't tell them how to do things. But in the context that we're discussing, we thought, we know these sectors really well, that we could be a voice piece alongside those who represent providers to in discussions with the department and government to help the sector be understood and help to get the best support for them that we could.
And does this shift, if it is even a shift, moving to supporting registered managers to provide assistance and guidance, did that reflect a shift in the CQC's position away from regulating and scrutiny, if I can use that word, to a slightly different approach of we're going to help managers?
I would say that our approach has always been to be supportive, because actually what we're all interested in, providers and CQC, is good quality, safe care and people having positive experiences. And in social care, it's about people living their best lives. So I'd say we were supportive. We've always given guidance on how we expect the regulations to be met and so on. What was very different was the level of practical guidance. So a conversation with an inspector about we haven't got enough PPE, that, you know, normally an inspector would not then be ringing round to both the local authority and other providers and organising for PPE to be shared. And it's that level of practical support that was different. But I would say generally, we are supportive of the sector and of providers.
We'll come to work through perhaps some of those mechanisms and support momentarily. Just while this document's on the screen, however, the continuing use of provider information returns, it's noted there that this would continue and it would be a source of information. They were subsequently stopped on the 15th of April 2020. Why, having expressed on the 16th of March that these documents would be, these returns would be important, were they then stopped by the time we get to the 15th of April?
Well, I wasn't directly involved in that to know exactly, but those PIR returns are information about a service, and we use it to plan and take account of in our routine inspections. So I think it would have been much clearer in those days between those two decisions. What we didn't stop was formal notification. So we continued to get information from providers. But yes, we did pause PIRs. And when they came back in a reduced form. That was all about lifting burden.
Okay. And I think the inquiry in your statement can see that there was ongoing notifications and they also had been enhanced.
Yes.
During that period. But I suppose the question is, did those notifications answer a slightly different question from what was in the PIR in terms of they're more about this is the current state of COVID or COVID issues in the home, whereas these PIR returns were more focused on regulation and issues. You know, was there a gap created whenever that was stopped on the 15th of April?
I would say not, because we weren't doing routine inspections at that time. And we already had banked information from each provider, and we were in contact through the different forms of monitoring that we'll come on to discuss. So the important thing was that notifications continued. So I don't think we had a significant gap through that suspension.
Okay, thank you. Now, just then, if we move on to the issues or the mechanisms by which CQC received assurance and or provided support in the absence of those inspections. We're going to come on momentarily to discuss the emergency support framework. However, it's understood that that only came into place at the very start of May 2020. So what was the CQC doing mid-March to the end of April 2020 to ensure that it was regulating, it was monitoring what was going on, and also, as you say, supporting as well?
In social care, before we had what the emergency support framework gave us was literally a framework, a means of capturing information and a managed conversation. We can come on to talk about that. It took us that time to set up the mechanisms by which we could undertake that and record. But ahead of that, the instruction we gave to inspectors was to call the registered managers of the services they had on their individual portfolios. So each inspector had their list of organisations that they were responsible, the relationship that they had the relationship with. And it started with, but it was very informal without that structure, but make contact with them, but start with the ones you're most worried about. But then the framework gave more formality. And some of those staff were, of course, involved in the design and building of the means to do that. There were some that returned to the front line of delivering services, and there were some that went on secondment to various places, including the department and some local authorities. So there was a movement round, but we were getting, the vast majority were still there, calling providers, getting the and dealing with the massive increase in queries that we were getting from both members of the public and providers.
Perhaps it's a good point then to launch into the emergency support framework. In your witness statement, you describe it as a structured phone conversation between the registered manager and the inspector. You stated they were not inspections, but supportive conversations with providers about challenges they were experiencing. And you also stated paragraph 279, the outcome of an ESF call did not lead to a change in the provider's rating, but would inform the ongoing assessment of the provider in relation to the level of risk present. Appreciating that these calls performed a supportive role, what, if any, assurance from a regulatory perspective could be gleaned from these structured phone conversations, which were primarily focused on support as opposed to those regulated activities?
Yeah. Those conversations did give us a picture on what was happening in that service. Some practical matters about access to PPE, aspects of infection control, staffing issues, were there any issues with supply of medication, access to medical care as needed. So it gave a picture of a service, and the judgment, such as it wasn't a rating, but the inspector would form a view as whether this service was managing or whether it needed support. And that the conversation was written up and sent to the provider as a record. So it's nothing like an inspection report, but it was a record of the conversation that went back to the provider, and it informed both the action on that. If some those cases where we thought they weren't managing, we didn't leave it there. We'd be attempting to access support for them, and it would also, once we were in a position to inspect, those obviously that weren't managing were a priority for us.
If I may have up on the screen then, INQ 000231915, please, which is correspondence from the Residents and Relatives Association of the 22nd of May. And if we could perhaps highlight the third paragraph there, please. Thank you so much. CQC produced an emergency framework on the 1st of May, but this did not include detailed policy or practical guidance to help providers ensure good communication to reassure families, or help to argue for and organise central supplies to protect staff and older people using services. No reassurance was provided from them or their representatives on how safety and well-being would be promoted with the disappearance of visits from family members and others. Do you accept the Relatives and Residents Association's views that these calls provided no reassurance?
Well, that I can see why they would say that, but from the information that I've set out in my statement and my experience of this is it did give us information to point to who was managing and who wasn't. We'll perhaps come on to discuss guidance, but our view is that in a pandemic situation, the best people to issue guidance are the government. And our advice would always be to providers to follow that government guidance. It's important the guidance is relevant for the sector, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that. But no, I have exhibited our response to this letter as part of my supplementary statement for the detail for the inquiries as to the answer to this. But no, I don't accept that it didn't give us information and assurance.
Just perhaps I'll clarify, you don't accept that it didn't give us information. That's perfect. Just then in terms of, if I may call it rather crudely, regulatory output, at paragraph 293 of your statement, you set out that there were 11,935 calls between May and October. Out of those, 301 care home providers needed support and 100 were inspected within 6 months. On reflection, is that a relatively low output of both regulatory action and also support from these phone calls?
I think what it demonstrates is how incredibly well the vast majority of the sector providers performed in unprecedented, situation. It was an awful time, and going back to the previous item, it was so hard for people not being able to visit. It was just so difficult, and I don't decry that at all, but generally, if I think pre-pandemic, most providers are good. When I look at ratings, it was generally around 80% of providers are good, 5% are outstanding, 5 less than 5 inadequate maybe, and the remainder requiring improvement. So this was a well-performing sector, and that went above and beyond with the challenges they faced.
If I could just return to the calls, please. I'm going to ask for INQ 00587-673 on page 5. This is a witness statement from the manager of a care home in England. It states, the first direct communication with the CQC didn't happen until July 2020, when we had a Teams call with our inspectors to assess how we were managing. This felt too late. I appreciate we can't go into specifics, but are the CQC satisfied that all registered services were contacted within a reasonable period of time for this service to provide benefit?
Well, the context is, as the numbers you gave earlier, we're talking about the best part of 25,000 registered services and 637 adult social care inspectors at the time. So the important thing about the emergency support framework was it gave inspectors a means by which to prioritise the calls that they made. Because obviously it was going to take some time to get through the numbers. And it may well be that a call that happened in July may have been a service with a good rating and for which the intelligence that we had about it didn't give particular cause for alarm. But with the numbers that had to be done, we did need a means of prioritising. But it was absolutely our ambition to speak to everybody.
You've put great weight on the supportive element of this. So if I could ask then, for INQ 000614375, page 16 to be put on the screen, which is a witness statement from a Miss Julianne Parkinson, manager of a DCA and member of the National Association of Care and Support Workers. She states, throughout the pandemic, I received one phone call from my CQC inspector. This was intended to be a support call. However, I consider it to be neither helpful nor supportive. I do not feel that they offer me any tangible support or acknowledge things we were doing well. Were these calls, in fact, supportive?
They were absolutely intended to be supportive. I can't speak to the detail of this particular one, but looking at all the words on the screen, I'm very concerned that anyone has felt threatened and bullied. That is absolutely not the vibe that we want to operate in. A supportive approach gets the best results in my long experience in regulation. So I'm very sorry that this was the experience of this person. But no, we have other feedback that many found them supportive. But I absolutely understand, it is a challenge for some, for that sense of being regulated and judged.
We may have already addressed this, but on reflection, was this ESF process a suitably robust alternative for routine inspections, or was it even intended to be that?
It was intended to facilitate a risk-based, prioritised contact with the providers registered with us. But as we went on, we developed from an emergency situation into a sort of the second approach, the transition approach, where we were widening the sort of areas that we were looking at and taking account of more intelligence. So it was a step along the way, and I think the various iterations and developments of this framework became a better, I'm not going to say substitute, because I think there is no substitute for on-the-ground inspections, but certainly intelligence and ongoing contact has an important role to play.
May I just move on to some interaction then between the CQC and the then Minister of State for Care, Miss Whately. There was a meeting which took place on the 11th of June 2020, and I'd be grateful if that could be on the screen, please. It's INQ 000524915, and the second page of that, please. I think it's the second bullet point down. The CQC have just informed the Minister that 5,000 ESF calls had taken place. But the Minister has recorded a statement she did not feel there is visibility of what interactions are being undertaken by LA, which local authorities, I assume, or CQC to ensure that there was safe care going on. She says, I feel I have no intel, no idea what they have found. It's a black, supposedly, hole for me. And then 2 further bullet points down, the Minister confirmed this would be that she felt there were still significant gaps in what she was seeing and what's being done. She said that when she is asked how sure she is that people haven't died in care homes from neglect, she doesn't have that assurance. At that time, at the 11th of June, do you accept there was significant gaps in what the Minister was being told?
I think we had gaps in expectations. So my recollection and the evidence that I've reviewed as preparation for today shows very high levels of contact with the department from early March, if not earlier. And certainly there were many meetings, twice weekly, I think there was one forum the Minister chaired herself, and we were sharing information as we went along. I think it was May, from what I've seen, the sort of first set of detailed slides as a means of presenting evidence. But the first, I think those slides, which I think we have exhibited, cover the period from March. I think the Minister wanted more and more detail, and understandably, in the circumstances, wanted quite a lot of operational detail. And I think we strove to give her as much as we could. But it isn't a tap of data in the way that the NHS is. So in terms of what is available and how to marshal it. And we certainly got into a regular rhythm of more detail on assurance as we went on.
There was a subsequent meeting then which took place on the 1st of July between the CQC and the Minister. I'd be grateful if I could have the email correspondence arising out of that on the screen. So INQ 000609960. I think it's, yes, the penultimate sentence states that the Minister was also really clear that while she agreed with the CQC decision to stop routine inspections during the pandemic, she did not agree that this was done at the risk of neglect abuse to residents. And the CQC representative at the meeting's comments today did not assure her in this point. And we don't need to go there, but the readout of the meeting again records that the Minister was really concerned about this. So at the 10th or 11th of June, we have, in effect, gaps in what the Minister's being told. And by the time we get to the 1st of July, the Minister is expressing significant concern about what she is, in fact, being told. Does this demonstrate that whatever processes the CQC put in place weren't sufficient to guard against or protect the rights of those receiving care?
I think on the exhibit you've just shown me, over the page, there is a reference to one of the people in the department saying that she doesn't understand the basis of that concern because CQC have been providing information and it shaped the approach from the start. So I think this is an expectation gap rather than it would be impossible for any one individual on any day to be assured about the level of safety in 25,000 separate organisations and locations. This is why we have a framework of standards and expectations about how care should be delivered, and the vast majority of providers strive every day to meet and exceed those standards. It had been pointed out, we knew that it was a balance of risk when not being out on routine inspections and that reduced contact, and provider representatives were saying the same. So I think it's, and the minister, with all she had on at the time, you'd have to ask her, but I think I go back to, I think it was a gap in expectation as to how much operational detail that we might have had at our fingertips to provide. But the overall assurance by the work that we were undertaking, the contact we did have, what we were finding on those early inspections, we shared what we had with the department. Of course, what goes on in the department in terms of how much reaches the minister is another matter. I couldn't speak to that, but there is certainly a lot of direct contact over this time. Some 50 meetings, I think, before July.
Given the time allowed, I don't have the opportunity to go through each and every iteration of these processes, but over time, the emergency support framework was built on to become the transitional monitoring activity, then became direct monitoring activity in October 2020 and June 21. But if I could please have up on the screen paragraph 73 of your statement at INQ 0005845, page 73, paragraph 215. And you've set out here a table of the number of inspections of care homes in particular, and we can see that in 2019 there were some 8,155. There was a dip then in 2020, which is to be expected in light of all we've discussed, down to 4,793. But by the end of 2023, the number of inspections hadn't got back to pre-pandemic levels. Could you explain why that's the case?
Post the pandemic and going forward, there was a change of approach. We had a transformation at CQC that was designed to be really an intelligence-led and target our activity. But I think, as is in the public domain, that we now regard as a failed transformation. It was a change that changed our IT system, that changed our structure, and that changed our operating model and procedures. And a series of reports have documented what happened to CQC in that time. So we didn't recover our pre-pandemic levels, though we are on course to doing that now. But yeah, that unfortunately is what happened.
Is that reflective of some of those other issues you're talking about, or is that reflective of a move more towards intelligence? Is there an element to which this has all moved towards an intelligence basis, as well as perhaps some of those practical?
Intelligence has always been important and will be important. We need to marshal the intelligence we have so that we're as fleet of foot as we can be. The cause of the failed transformation is, well, it's multifactorial, it's very complex. It's set out in a number of public documents, the Dash report, the Richards report, the Rayner report. It would take too long to give you even a précis, but it was a very complex, very difficult time for CQC, and we're very much looking forward to a complete recovery.
Okay, thank you. Before we finish on the issue of inspections, I'd just like to deal with one or two more discrete matters. Paragraph 247 of your witness statement. You're talking about communications with the Department of Health. And you state that we also noted that we did not expect to be taking significant enforcement action during the pandemic, as in the main, it would not pass the public interest test. As you outlined at the start, enforcement's part of the global umbrella of regulation, so therefore, in normal times, if I may say it, there is a public interest in taking enforcement action. Why in March 2020, was CQC adopting the position that they were unlikely to take enforcement action going forward?
We didn't say we were unlike. Did we say it hasn't
We do not
appeared on?
expect, forgive me for
hasn't
speaking over you,
appear-
we do not expect to be taking significant enforcement action.
Yeah.
Would you like me to get the paragraph on the screen for you?
Yeah, it hasn't appeared. I don't know if it should have done, but it hasn't.
I think it's on me as opposed to you. Can we please have INQ 000584245, please? And that would be at page 81 of the statement. So it's paragraph 247 in particular, please. And it's the very last sentence. We also noted that we did not expect to be taking significant enforcement action during the pandemic, as in the main, it would not pass the public interest test.
Okay. So we have two forms of enforcement, civil and criminal, with different levels of test. The civil enforcement is really about prevention of harm, whereas criminal is about holding people to account for harm that's happened. So as a proportion of inspections and enforcement, those early inspections was actually quite high in terms of significant enforcement action, some of which is ongoing, where we found very serious concerns where inspectors had to literally call ambulances, get people moved out into hospital and so on, where there had been very, very serious levels of neglect. And there were places where we on a civil basis, would agree that there'd be no further admissions into that service until things had balanced. But yes, I mean, they were unprecedented times. So we were suspecting that enforcement that might have been in normal times the right way forward, that there would be other better means to achieve the same ends.
Just so I can be clear, you set out in this correspondence on the 11th of March 2020 that you did not expect to be taking significant enforcement activity, but your evidence that notwithstanding that enforcement activity did continue.
It did. I think we have submitted the detail of the numbers of civil actions that we took.
If I may turn just briefly to virtual inspections, I can see they were piloted for domiciliary care agencies between September and November 2020. During the pandemic, was any type of virtual inspection methodology used for residential nursing homes?
No, not that we'd call an inspection. For domiciliary care, we don't go into individual people's homes. It was all pre-pandemic. It was about the visit would actually be to the office. And offices are easy where the provider is set up to visit virtually and where they can share records to review records urgently. And we have different ways of collecting feedback from people who are using the service, different ways of talking to staff. But that doesn't translate easily to a setting where people are receiving care in that setting that's registered with us.
So you mentioned there were no inspections, but there was some form of virtual contact. Obviously, the calls we've referenced earlier with.
Yes, we were making. I don't think we ever changed a rating as a result of that virtual contact. I think ratings get changed when on-the-ground inspections happen.
And in the event of a future pandemic, do you consider that there's any scope to use such virtual inspections, or given the issues you've discussed about the nature of residential nursing homes, is it a non-starter from a regulation point of view?
Well, part of the answer would be it depends in terms of what that future pandemic was actually involved. But as a principle, there will always be a place for on-the-ground inspections to visit the place where care is delivered, to observe, have the chance to talk to people who work there, who live there, to those who are visiting there, and to observe interactions. That will always be important.
Okay. Just in the process of finishing our discussion on inspections, I'd just like to offer you the opportunity to reflect on a few points. So, like you said out in your statement, a key concern of the CQC is about avoiding closed cultures. which is defined as a poor culture that can lead to harm, including human rights breaches such as abuse. Do you accept that taking inspectors off the ground or suspending routine inspections created a heightened risk of such closed cultures developing or perhaps being undetected?
Closed environments, which effectively care homes became, do increase the risk of a closed culture emerging, but it's not the only factor. Geography can play a part, and certainly people who having visits to the home from families and friends, from visiting professionals, all of that helps. But the fundamental feature of a closed culture is it's the weather that's set by the leadership. In a place where staff are encouraged and supported to raise their concerns, that's a safe place, and that guards against the emergence of a closed culture. But certainly creating closed environments on the scale, it does increase the risk. It is inevitable, but so that's why we took the action we took to increase awareness. We're alert to that. So in our interactions with providers, we were raising the profile of that. And there was some significant work during 2020 going on the whole concept of closed cultures.
Just like to give you the opportunity to comment and reflect on two bits of evidence the inquiry has received then. So if I could have INQ 000514104 on the screen, please, and that's page 97, paragraph 250. Thank you. This is a witness statement provided by the Johns campaign, and which also includes the Rights for Relatives Association, who we discussed earlier. We and those we supported felt that the CQC abdicated responsibility during the pandemic and that oversight and regulation were lacking, that they had been abandoned in the name of infection control. I'm not trying to be unfair to you, but there's another quote which is very similar, which I might want to get you to reflect on at the same time. If I could have INQ 004753131, please, on the screen. It's page 32, paragraph A. This is evidence from Professor Vic Rayner, who states that the decisions made by the CQC in March 2020 effectively resulted in the withdrawal of CQC oversight from adult social care services for the duration of the pandemic. Do you agree that there was an abdication of responsibility or withdrawal of the CQC from the adult social care sector?
I do not. In my statement and the evidence I've discussed this morning, it was routine inspections that were paused. I absolutely accept that it would have felt very different for providers and for families, but inspections did resume once we had PPE. The threshold changed over time. We did make, I think in my statement it says some 19,000 calls. There were some approaching 5,000 inspections. I've made in my recommendation, in our recommendations, we would, in the right situation for the future, like to be in a position to continue inspecting in a future pandemic, and we would very much like to see visiting facilitated and continue for the new regulation on visiting to continue to be observed in a future pandemic.
The recommendation contained within your addendum statement is that it's for the CQC to recognise the importance of on-site inspections and ensure the ability to conduct on-site inspections to allow CQC, as the regulator, to be able to continue to assure safety and quality of service provision. I appreciate, as you say, we don't know what any future pandemic might look like, but acknowledging the importance of ensuring there are inspections in the future, what practically can be done or put in place to ensure that those inspections could continue in the event of a future pandemic?
It would be the recognition, not just for CQC, but for social care generally, to be an equal partner in this with health, and for the PPE, the testing, the vaccination priority that health got for social care to have, both those who work in social care and for CQC. If we had been designated frontline workers, we would have had access to things like the asymptomatic testing far earlier. It took us months from July to December to achieve that. And then it was achieved largely through the lobbying of providers who wanted us back on the scene. So if we were equipped to do so, we would want to continue inspecting, and that sort of structure, the kit, could allow visiting to continue as well.
Do you consider that there's need for clear, adaptable protocols which set out clear criteria or clear plans for hybrid, in-person, virtual inspections, which are reviewed earlier or reviewed regularly to make sure they don't go stale and can access all the information? Would something like that be of use if there was very clear processes and protocols already in existence before the next pandemic?
Yes, I think we've learnt so much. We need to take what we've learnt and apply it to the planning for the next one, absolutely.
I'm at risk of asking you an unfair question. Has that process started?
I think we've learnt so much. And so I think what would stop us next time is if we haven't got PPE, if we can't do it safely. It'll always be the safety. So if we're in a position to safely continue inspecting in a way that doesn't increase the risks for those living in homes drawing on domiciliary care, then we'd want to be able to continue.
So could I, forgive my interrupting, Mr. Beech's question was, you've learned lessons, I understand that, and I understand that you would have liked access to testing and PPE, but the question included a reference to your plans and protocols, and I think Mr. Beech was trying to find out whether there were any plans and protocols now in place as a result of the lessons you say you've learned.
Yeah, we've continued to develop our framework. We had, which is currently being reviewed. In our new framework, we had, if I take DNA CPR as an example, the experiences that we had during the pandemic with that has informed what we call a quality statement. It is so the way we assess future care planning and do not resuscitate orders has already been informed by what we learned. So the frameworks, the way we conduct our business, in terms of the current state of CQC's pandemic plan, I am not able to answer that, but we could provide that to the inquiry if helpful. I know we're participating with the department and others in planning for future pandemics, and currently working on should a future pandemic also be respiratory in the way this one was. So we are working with others on that, but it has informed some of our regulatory approaches. And if you'd like more detail on that, we can provide it.
Thank you, Milady. Just before we leave the topic of inspections, there's a statement from Dr. Townsend that's been provided, who was Chief Executive of the Home Care Association. I don't know if we have it available on the screen for you, but it appears at INQ 000587670, page 110. But she says that the decision to suspend inspections effectively resulted in the withdrawal of meaningful oversight from home care services for much of the pandemic. I'm aware that a lot of what we've discussed this morning would appear to centre on residential care and nursing homes. But was there a withdrawal of meaningful oversight for home care or domiciliary providers?
They were I think on reflection, there was more that we could have done for domiciliary care providers. The focus was on, because of the spread we got a pandemic that was spread person to person. The focus was on those settings where there were people living together, as opposed to people living in their own homes with care workers visiting. But we did act on the suggestion to experiment with remote, and we did pilot remote inspections for dom care, and that is now pretty much it is the standard way of working. So we would be able to continue inspecting in similar circumstances.
Thank you. We've touched on it quite a bit this morning already, on the issue of testing of inspectors. You've said how there was correspondence or ongoing engagement between CQC and the department, which ultimately resolved in December 2020. A brief question: were the issues being raised with CQC, were they practical in terms of there just wasn't testing capacity to test CQC inspectors, or was it something else?
It may well have been in the early days when the availability of tests was an issue. In the discussions, and I think it's in the exhibits, that there was a view from health that because CQC inspectors didn't deliver hands-on care, that they didn't, it wouldn't be necessary. But it wasn't a distinction that we were comfortable with, because inspectors do go into people's rooms, they do talk to people, and we are talking about, we understand the way the virus is spread. We could be touching surfaces and et cetera, et cetera. So we weren't content with that as a reason, but that there was a sense that in some quarters that it wasn't necessary. That was a health view. It certainly wasn't the social care view.
You do set out a recommendation which you say might help solve this issue, which says in the future to ensure inspectors are treated as key workers at the outset of future pandemic with priority access to testing, PPE, vaccinations and IPC. Just the use of the word priority access, what level of access? Is it akin to social care workers in terms of access to those things?
Sorry, could you repeat the end part of that question?
You talk about getting priority access to PPE and testing, just in the use of the word priority. What level of priority do you think should be ascribed to inspectors? The same as care workers?
If it came to a choice between care workers and inspectors, I'd choose the care workers because obviously they're the ones delivering care. But recognising the importance that we place on inspections and our wish in the future to continue, I think that's what we're recommending, that CQC inspectors should be treated as frontline key workers and have the same access as health and care workers.
Moving on to the issue of infection prevention and control, and you've set out in your statement how the CQC took on perhaps an enhanced role regarding IPC in the relevant period. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you conducted a number of IPC-focused inspections. You reported the findings of those to the Minister. They appeared to provide some assurance that good processes were being followed. But just almost coming to the end of that process then, in January 2021, there was a request from DHSC for the CQC to increase the number of IPC inspections. To what extent did this new focus on IPC take resources away from the CQC's kind of more traditional statutory role regarding regulation?
It was more a refocus than taking away. IPC has always been an element in inspections. It's important in care homes. Pre-pandemic, to control the spread of flu and norovirus is very important. So, but there was, going in that summer of 2020, there was a lot of public concern that a sense that social care wasn't managing this very well, I think related to the spread and to the increase in deaths. And so we got a framework together. We went out. It was a minimally took up about 2 hours within a care home, so we could get through a lot quite quickly. And it was an observational tool that looked at how IPC was being managed throughout the home. What it did do was demonstrate that providers were actually managing it very well, which was assurance to both the Minister and the public that that was happening. I mean, it did feel very invasive for people. Some of the PPE in itself, and the when they were visiting, as we know, went through a number of iterations, and I think some felt it got in the way. But the important point was that this is something that has always providers have always had to take account of. It was of a different level during the pandemic, and our evidence is that they rose to that challenge well.
Does CQC still perform that enhanced IPC role, or is that being dispensed with?
Well, as I say, it is already. It's part of the regulatory framework. We are still looking at it, but we're not undertaking at the moment IPC-specific inspections.
Thank you. On the issue then of related to IPC, but concerns about staff working after a positive COVID test, if I may refer you to the evidence of Miss Waitley as contained in her witness statement at INQ 000587788 and paragraph 172. Around January 2021, I received reports of care home staff continuing to work in care homes after testing positive for COVID-19. These reports came in from a team I set up with the support of Michelle Dyson to increase operational capacity in social care team in DHSC. Would you have expected the CQC to have picked up on this issue as opposed to it being flagged by an internal departmental structure?
I think we're referring here to the ASC task force, and our chief inspector was invited by David Pearson, who chaired that, to be part of that. So we would have, my understanding of the evidence is that we would have fed into that. And as often with a number of issues, it was reaching the ears of the department, and it was reaching our ears through sometimes the same, sometimes different sources. But we were certainly picking up on issues of concern about staff working when they're tested positive, which is completely unacceptable.
The CQC do put out a statement then on the 27th of January 2021, in fact saying this should happen under no circumstances. What, if any, further action did CQC take to investigate or to bottom out the extent or nature of those concerns?
I think I'm not over the detail on this. My apologies. We can provide further information. I think we identified some 50 or so cases that we were aware of, but the detailed action with those providers I couldn't say. I think we were concerned in the discussions about this to understand why people were motivated to work when they tested positive, and so that the right support could be given to workers to not work, as it were.
Very briefly then, on the topic of visiting, the inquiry has engaged a Professor Banerjee, who's produced a report which can be found at INQ 000546956. It's page 68, paragraph 171. In this paragraph, Professor Banerjee is summarising some evidence contained in a different report by Dr. Gibson, but he notes that managers in England saw the CQC as a potential threat during the period, that's of the pandemic, more likely to criticise their visiting policy rather than support them to develop a safe one. Others saw CQC as inconsistent and reactive, initially giving the clear message that care homes should not allow visitors, and then later blaming them for implementing blanket bans. Is that a characterisation of the CQC that you recognise and do you wish to reflect on it?
I don't recognise that as the place that I work, but we have our critics, and I do understand that there are people that feel that way. I think in the same report there is also a reference to that Professor Banerjee's team did find people who spoke positively of the support that they'd received from CQC. And for clarification, at no time did we set visiting policies. That was the work of the government, and it was a challenge because they changed frequently. They got complex as the concept of tiers came and went, and it was a challenge for all of us to keep up with it. But we're not into the blame game. We are into the accountability game, and sometimes the difference between those two is not always understood.
Thank you. Just in fairness to you, you're quite right that Professor Banerjee's report does note that these experiences weren't universal.
Yeah.
Milady, I don't know if now is a convenient time to
It
take
is
a break.
certainly. I shall return. I hope you all won't be take regular breaks, but I think we shall finish you before lunch. I shall return at midday.
Thank you.
Mr. Beach.
Thank you, Milady. Well before the break, we were discussing the various factors which CQC took into account when deciding to suspend routine inspections, and you outlined the 3 operational principles. Ultimately, they all boil down to reducing footfall and protecting residents. To what extent, if at any, did the desire or the need to redeploy inspectors to help on the front line inform CQC's reasoning?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. From the records I've seen, that wasn't a factor in. So did it boil down to we hadn't got enough people because we'd redeployed them elsewhere, so we had to do it this way? I'm confident the answer's no. We did support redeployment where people had got particular skills and were able to return. But no, we had the vast majority of our inspection workforce was available to us. Not all were able to leave, of course. Some were shielding themselves. Some were in households where people were shielding or in the same household as a frontline worker. So there were other those sorts of considerations, but it wasn't a fact that because we'd redeployed people, we hadn't got enough people to inspect.
Thank you. Could I just turn to the issue of DNA CPR notices? The inquiry's heard plenty of evidence about reports that the CQC published in March 2021, the final report on this issue. And the CQC were directed by the Minister for Mental Health, I believe, to undertake that review. In your statement, you set out that CQC were aware of concerns about DNA CPRs as early as March 2020. Why did the CQC not proactively produce a report of that nature or go away and investigate what was going on at that stage, so at the earlier stage of March 2020?
Okay. A particular report of that nature would require an additional commission from a minister. A Section 48 request would give us the powers to write a report. Our powers as they exist go to the assessment, the inspection, preparation of report on an individual service. To look more widely, we need those powers. But DNA CPR had been a concern to us in terms of blanket DNA CPRs had been flagged in the learning disability world the previous year, where we became aware through the leader death reviews that it was more likely that blanket reviews would be imposed. So that March action to make a very clear statement was a reaction, and was a reaction to the concerns that were being brought, and may well have had an impact in reducing that. But we were also concerned about an increase in the number of individual DNA CPRs. They're two separate issues, blanket versus an increase in the individual. And in discussions with the department, that was how we came to be commissioned to write that report. I don't have the date to hand, but I'm thinking late summer, and the interim report, I think, was very early December, which set out very clearly what the rules were.
Thank you.
And flagged best practice.
Thank you. Just as you mentioned there, Section 48, you would have needed Section 48 direction. At no stage did the CQC in March 2020 flag to the department, we think this is an issue which might need looked into. Could you direct us to do it to cover us from the legal point of view?
There were two separate issues. So the first issue was blanket bans, which was a no-brainer, unacceptable. We wrote to every care provider about it, as well as that joint statement that was issued, and the NHS wrote to every GP. So, and they are the key players to heighten awareness and make people aware. The increase in individual DNA orders was an issue that emerged as the year went on. The original issue was blanket, and then it became a slightly different issue. And the nature of these things is that we would have been talking to the department, asking them to commission us, which is what happened.
Thank you. The final report then makes a recommendation. It's recommendation 11, that the CQC must continue to seek assurance that people are at the centre of personalised, high-quality and safe experiences when it comes to DNA CPR decisions in a way that protects their human rights. To do this, we will ensure a continued focus on DNA CPR decisions through our monitoring, assessment and inspection of all health and adult social care providers. And CQC is identified as the lead for that action. Has that recommendation been actioned? Is there now that focus? Yes,
in our new framework, the look at forward planning takes account of this. I mean, it's always been a factor in assessment, but it has more heightened awareness. And our internal action was to invest in awareness and training for our own staff, because it's a difficult issue. It's frequently misunderstood, and we wanted to make sure that our own staff were confident to have the conversations needed with providers and to be able to point providers in the right direction. Was there any, in the event of any misunderstanding about it?
And just finally, on like a general point, prior to the pandemic or during, did the CQC have any role with regards to registering or making a note of which care homes could or could not bring in place isolation practices?
No, we didn't. We did later in the pandemic get involved in a scheme of what was known as designated settings, which were care homes that did have the facilities and staff to be able to safely isolate COVID-positive patients. And they were nominated by the local authority, and then we would inspect them and agree or not that they could become designated settings.
Thank you. Throughout this morning, we've discussed a number of recommendations regarding PPE and testing going forward. I just wish to explore a couple more with you before I'm finished with you this morning. Professor Rayner, whose statement we've already looked at, is at INQ 000475131. And could have page 33, paragraph 6.1F on the screen, please. In her statement, and just while that's loading, she sets out that given its practical knowledge and position, consideration should be given to whether the CQC should have taken the leading role in the preparation of guidance to the social care sector, which arguably would have ensured more realistic and practical guidance. I suppose the question is the CQC responsible for producing guidance to adult social care? And going forward, do you consider that it should be responsible for producing guidance?
Okay, so our current powers on guidance are confined to guidance about compliance and how to meet the fundamental standards. It doesn't go wider than that. We think government are the best placed to provide guidance in a pandemic. What we need is guidance that is relevant to social care and is not health sector guidance adjusted for social care. It's a very diverse sector, as I've referred to, with lots of different sized providers. The best way to really good guidance is to have that genuinely co-produced with those who provide services, those who receive services, and the various experts in terms of infection prevention, control, and so on. And I think CQC has a role in that, perhaps even as a lead facilitator of it. But I think CQC would effectively otherwise be providing guidance about guidance. And I don't think that's a healthy state. I think it's the road to confusion for providers. I think one set of guidance, co-produced, that relevant and impactful for social care is what we need.
Thank you. And two, hopefully, very brief ones. Do you consider that the CQC should be responsible for assessing pandemic preparedness plans, whether they be on the part of local authorities or perhaps even plans held by registered services?
At the moment, we don't have the powers to do that, either for a provider or a local authority. Social care providers are not required to have a pandemic plan. They are required, and we would look at it under the regulation that where we review governance in an organisation. They are required to have contingency plans, but in the normal run of things, they might be for power outages, a flood, inability to get hold of medicines, that sort of thing. Whereas in a pandemic, I think it would be wrong to consider providers as islands who should each in their own way produce their own pandemic guidance. It's the system. So you couldn't have a care home plan that didn't take account of what the GPs who serve that care home, what their plans are. So I think a system level plan with the local authority as a key player in that is the way to go. At the time of the pandemic, we had no responsibilities regarding local authorities. We do now. We assess local authorities for their delivery under Part 1 of the Care Act. So again, currently we don't have the powers, but you can see in a way that it could be adjusted, that in either our system assessment or local authority assessment, that would be something that we could look at.
Final one then is that there's currently no register for care workers in England. A two-part question. Firstly, do you think it would be of benefit to have such a register of care workers? And secondly, who should have responsibility for maintaining that register?
We would like to see a register of care workers because it would acknowledge them as a profession. And along with a register would come a clear educational offer, and it would have an impact in all sorts of ways that professional registration does. It would raise the status and recognise the incredible skills and role of care workers. So a register, I think, would be a very positive step going forward. Whether it should be CQC that hold that register, that would be quite an extension of our current powers. And again, that would be something I'd be keen that was co-produced in discussion with the sector. There is no Royal College for care at the moment. There might be organisations that perform that role in another guise, but I think to truly recognise and support care as a profession, a register would be a strong step to that, and we could collectively consider who best would hold it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Critch. I have no further questions. Thank you, milady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beach. Ms. Morris. Ms. Morris is just there.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Cridge. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice, and I've got 3 topics I'd like to ask you some short questions about, please. The first topic is around data on deaths within care settings. And you say in your first witness statement that the CQC receives death notifications as part of its regulatory functions in relation to registered providers, but that you don't receive, for example, records of where people die. But you explained in your statement that the purpose of those notifications isn't to monitor mortality or to create mortality statistics. So my question is this. isn't understanding where, when, and sometimes why someone's died not essential to the CQC's oversight function?
Yes. Death data is essential for us, which is why it is a notifiable event that providers are required to tell us about. We extended that during COVID to ask providers to notify us if they suspected or confirmed that the cause of death was COVID. So we ask a range of information about the characteristics of that person, but it's not all mandatory. That element is not all mandatory or indeed systematic. So we know the locations that have reported it. What we didn't do until 2021 was publish that at location level.
Okay. But you do now, is that the position?
I don't think we have published death data in that way, but I can check and come back.
Thank you. Specifically in relation to the collection of data around deaths of people with learning disabilities, you say in your statement that it would be disproportionate and inappropriate to routinely rely on the use of your statutory powers to require documents and information from requested registered providers to obtain that data. But again, do you accept that that data is extremely important to understanding the impact of COVID-19 on people with a learning disability?
We did receive that data, and we did identify an increase in notifications, and we did report on that in one of our data insight reports, because it became apparent that people with a learning disability, that deaths through COVID had increased, and I can speak to that if that would be helpful.
I'm trying to understand with these questions whether the pandemic exposed a sort of significant and serious gap in the data that was available to the CQC, and if you like, demonstrated the need for a single and reliable source for that data around deaths.
So the single reliable source ultimately was the Office for National Statistics. And I think our concern as the pandemic went on was to provide the government with the information, share the information we had. And the ONS was publishing deaths in care homes by summarised by local authority area on a weekly basis alongside confirmed registered deaths. And as time went on, it became apparent that our death notification data was indeed a very reliable lead indicator for registered deaths. But during 2020, the publication of that, we didn't feel we could do that safely because there were so many variables. But definitely our head of intelligence worked very closely with the department, the ONS and others to sort of regularise and clean the data, the protocols around statistics so that they could be properly met.
Thank you. My second topic is around care home visiting arrangements. So Mr. Beach has touched on the general issue about guidance, and I think you've said in some of your answers already that there was an issue around a challenge around consistency, and it's a little more detail around that I want to ask you about, please. You say in your second witness statement, and I'm just going to quote, the rights and wishes of those using adult social care services must remain in focus at all times. During the pandemic, the rules about visiting in care settings caused suffering and harm both to people using care services and their loved ones. You'd recognise that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So just looking at a little more detail around the relevant rules and guidance during the period, you notice that in your statement that on the 15th of March, the CQC circulated an intended letter to providers which emphasised the then current PHE guidance on visiting in care homes. And the CQC position was that care homes should not close their doors to visitors, and to indicate the CQC did not expect to see care homes closing their doors to visitors. I think you'd accept, though, by March 2020, the media was widely covering the fact that significant numbers of care homes were already implementing what we can term blanket bans on visitors. Was that communication or intended communication from the CQC sort of seeking to address the concern about the imposition on blanket bans?
Yeah, so our position was, is, and always will be that the person-centred care and decisions is the most important thing. The visiting, the instruction to stop visiting when it came was a surprise to us. We weren't informed of it. We discovered it on one of our regular checks of government guidance. We pointed out at various stages where the rules for care homes were different from the rules for hospitals, which were still allowing end of life related visits. And we flagged when we noticed the admissions guidance, for instance, was in conflict with the visiting guidance. And even with all the guidance issues going around, providers were making their own decisions, sometimes sort of related to the prevalence of the virus in their area. I think all motivated from a point of safety, but it became difficult to keep up. And when tiers became a thing and there were different arrangements in different parts of the country, I think the complexity of the whole thing got very difficult.
I think you agree with my next question. You already answered it. You say you were surprised that the government advice came out and such an important change was made about blanket bans without consulting the CQC. You were surprised by it. Had you been consulted, would you advise that it be appropriate to maintain visiting with appropriate IPC measures put in place, for example, particularly in order to sort of maintain the human rights of both the people with care needs and their visitors?
Our fundamental position was that the decisions should be person-centred and that the right decision for individuals. But I think in the early days of the pandemic, it was providers were trying to take account of an emerging situation that was new to all of us and trying to do the right thing. And it did lead to some early bans before it was official.
Do you think that confusion and the absence of advice and clarification from the CQC or others increase the likelihood of those providers going for the blanket ban option rather than that person-centred or more nuanced approach?
Sorry, could you repeat the first element?
Do you think the confusion, or use the word complexity, in the area increase the likelihood of providers imposing a blanket ban rather than using an individual-based approach?
I think so. I think they were, there was different advice from Public Health England at different times and in different places. I think to be put in the... And these are, some of these they're not like in the NHS with the great structure around them. These are individual places trying to do their best in a frightening, confusing, changing situation. And our sense in looking at this is that the vast majority of providers did their best. And when there were some let-up, providers went to extraordinary lengths to keep contact, whether it was electronically or garden visits or all sorts of things. But it was a miserable experience for people and their loved ones.
Thank you. My third and final topic is the hospital discharge policy in March 2020, and I'll try and take this as quickly as I can. You deal with it in your first statement. You highlight on the 16th of March 2020 that the CQC was asked by the Department for Health and Social Care by email for a statement indicating, quote, complete support for the principles in their new hospital discharge guidance. Did CQC colleagues have concerns about the appropriateness of the CQC indicating complete support for the policy?
There was a lot of action that went on between that first contact. So we weren't involved in the development of the discharge guidance, and we didn't issue the statement in quite the way it was originally requested. Our involvement was limited to the trusted assessor guidance, and the original request was effectively to suspend the trusted assessor guidance. And trusted assessors, this was a thing pre-pandemic, and it's a very good way of speeding up hospital discharge and helping people to get to the right place for them when they leave hospital. But so what the end result, which is the important thing, is that Annex C of this policy was the trusted assessor guidance, and it basically said to the NHS to employ more trusted assessors, for those hospitals that weren't using them, to use them, to make the point that CQC will always put safety first.
Understood.
And also that the trusted assessors must take account of the legal responsibilities of social care providers.
Yes.
So that providers must ask themselves, can they care for this person safely? If they can, the second question is, if by taking this person, I am putting at risk the people who already live in this service, then the answer is no. So providers felt under a lot of pressure, and goodness me, we all understood the need to free up capacity in the NHS.
Quite.
But that was the limit, and we put our logo on that annex because that was the element we'd been involved with.
I understand. And you said in your statement that the CQC did express concerns that the guidance did leave providers with little or no power to challenge individual decisions if they felt an admission of an individual from a hospital wouldn't support their best interests. For example, if the care home didn't have sufficient PPE, right, or if they weren't able to safely accommodate individuals who needed to isolate. Given the stated object was to free up beds in hospitals and to move patients into care homes, was there a concern that the guidance would put those providers under that pressure to accept patients even when they didn't have suitable isolation facilities and PPE?
Well, the route in that first March guidance was through the trusted assessor. So this is somebody making a decision, and to do that properly, the trusted assessor has to take account of the ability of that particular care provider they're looking at to accommodate that person safely and not to endanger others in that service, as I've just explained. So we don't want to go from one bad situation to another, but providers definitely, small organisations, many of them, against the NHS in this emergency situation, of course they felt the pressure. The second piece of guidance relevant to this is the admissions guidance that came out on the 2nd of April.
I'm not going to ask you questions about that. I'm going to focus them very much on the discharge policy guidance.
Okay.
I'm also conscious of time. So can I just ask you just to acknowledge the fact that there was going to be significant pressure put by this guidance. And my underlying question is going to be, given you did agree to put the CQC's logo on that guidance, did that not give the impression that CQC endorsed it and therefore increase that pressure on providers?
This may sound like dancing on the head of a pin, but our logo was not on the front of that guidance. It was the DHSE and NHS on the front page. We were just on the item, the Annex C Trusted Assessor guidance that we'd been involved in. I know you don't want to get to the assessor guidance, to the admissions guidance, but actually it's part of the same person journey. I leave here, I go in here. And the admissions guidance was like the second half of the story because it reinforced the ability of a social care provider to say no.
Understand. Maybe just touching on that in my final set of questions, please. You say in your first witness statement that the CQC was aware of a number of concerns made in relation to decisions about individuals admitted from hospitals. And one example you give there is a 23rd of March query from a care home manager where a service user had tested positive for COVID, was asymptomatic, and the hospital had assessed him as medically fit for discharge. Do you accept that these examples demonstrate the extremely difficult position that providers felt themselves in, whereby they felt under pressure to accept patients who were either suspected COVID or unknown COVID status, despite not having sufficient PPE, isolation facilities to prevent the transmission of the virus to patients and staff?
I do accept that they were under extreme pressure, and it was a live discussion. The social care trade associations and CQC, amongst others, were having with the department.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Those are my
Thank
questions.
you, Ms Burrows. Ms Jones, who's over that way?
Oh, thank you.
Ms Cridge, I act for John's campaign, Care Rights UK and the Patients Association. And I'm going to take you back, if I may, to the issue of visiting restrictions. We've heard you say this morning that the intelligence that comes to the CQC from service users and their family members is, in your words, invaluable to understanding what's going on in a care home. But of course, a key part of the experience in adult social care during the pandemic was that family members were largely and for a very long time excluded from those settings. So arising from this, and given the harm that is caused by blanket bans on visits, including to oversight and monitoring of care, and the creation of closed cultures, do you consider that it would have been helpful for the CQC to collect data on whether care settings were complying with visiting guidance or imposing blanket bans, and for that to have been a metric that you took into account in assessing risk and deciding whether settings required inspection?
So, make sure I've understood the question correctly. So this is about, should CQC have collected data on visiting bans?
Yes, well, in your statement to the inquiry, you do explain that DHSC asked for that at one point, and that wasn't something that CQC was collecting. Would that have been something helpful to keeping on top of risks that were posed by changes introduced during the pandemic?
Well, it may have been, but the practicality of that, 25,000 registered providers, so we discount the dom care because it wouldn't apply. So we're still talking thousands of providers and locations. And in the normal run of events on with an infection, so say, for example, you've got norovirus, you suspected norovirus, you may want to take account of that, and then later that day that may have been resolved and it's fine. The day-to-day implementate in the normal run of things would have been a huge data collection exercise. There isn't a single IT system across social care, and not all social care providers are digitalised. So the actual act of collecting that, I think, would have been a real challenge. We since, of course, have Reg 9 that has rather established the ground that going forward there is that right. But when that regulation was brought in, it wasn't reportable. Having blanket bans wasn't reportable, so we don't know that. It is a regulation that DHSC are currently reviewing. So, you know, that may change in the future, but just the logistics of doing that for that number of settings, I think would have been challenging.
My lady, if I may ask a follow-on from that.
Well, I'm afraid we've got very short of time today, Mr Jones, so it'll have
will
to come
keep
out of
an eye on
your
my
time.
time.
And you've had a chunk of it now already.
I have, but I will be quick because you refer then to the logistical difficulty of collecting data, and we do keep hearing in the evidence to the inquiry in this module about the data and information gap in adult social care. Is that something the CQC is trying to take steps to address?
There is, well, yes, I think there is, the pandemic did expose the difference between the NHS and social care on data collection, no two ways about it. But it's the size and diversity of the sector. These are individual businesses, some for profit, some not. And with various, even in the NHS, systems don't talk to each other. So, I mean, there are some practical logistics here, and we need to get the right data at the right time and focus on what makes a difference to people's safety and experience, as opposed to everything that with hindsight we might have liked to have. But I think the fact that there's now a regulation for visiting to continue, and that is one of the recommendations I've made in my supplementary statement, we'd want to see everything done to keep that going in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic then, about the CQC's response to complaints about care providers. And we understand that the CQC would take account of complaints to determine whether to inspect care homes, but didn't actually play any role in resolving complaints, and instead would refer family members or service users back to the care home to have the substance of a complaint resolved. But many people had fears of adverse consequences. We know, for example, that eviction notices were sometimes issued when complaints were raised or members of staff were dismissed. In your view, would there have been a benefit in the establishment or existence at that time of an independent complaints mechanism? And why did such a mechanism not exist? And as I understand it, still does not exist.
That's something to ask the legislators. So the legal position is we have no power to investigate complaints, but where we're aware of them, we do take account of them as intelligence about a place. And we review a providers. It's part of the regulatory function to look at how they are dealing with complaints, because a good, well-run place will welcome feedback and complaints and deal with them well. So there isn't, it wasn't we don't have the legal power to do it. There is the local government ombudsman who does have a role. There is an alternative, forgive me. So if it's local authority commission, the ombudsman route exists. And I think there is another for private funded care. I'd have to double check that. I don't have that to hand.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Jones. And Ms Beattie. Ms Beattie's over there.
Thank you, Ms Critch. I act questions on behalf of disabled people's organisations. Back to DNA CPR. In the final report on DNA CPR in March 2021, the CQC concluded that there had not been a national blanket approach to DNA CPR, but that there was undoubtedly confusion at the outset of the pandemic and a sense that some providers felt under pressure to ensure DNA CPR decisions were in place. And Ms Critch, you say in your statement that you were able to provide reassurance around concerns about blanket usage, which had in part led to the review. Do you agree that the CQC's conclusion about the absence of a national blanket approach did not exclude that blanket approaches were taken locally and or for particular groups of people?
Yes, that is the evidence, that we couldn't find a source. It appeared in the early days that there may well have been some national instruction, because we were hearing the reports of so many from different sources. But if there was a central source, we never found it. And the evidence is it wasn't given, but they did break out, blanket did break out all over the place, and providers certainly felt the pressure.
Right, so just to be clear about that, so you were trying to find out whether there was, and to ask the specific question, was there a national blanket instruction, to which you thought the answer was no?
Yeah.
Is that right? But you thought there were, in fact, what I would call local blanket approaches, whether that be at the level of residential or care home, at the level of GP, is that right? Or
Yes, that's right.
For particular groups of people, such as people with learning disabilities?
Yes, that's right. We were concerned about the application to groups of people pre-pandemic. There was evidence in the LEADER work from 2019 that people with a learning disability were particularly susceptible, and DNA CPRs and even advanced care planning isn't for everybody. Advanced care planning should only be for people at risk of significant physical deterioration in the sort of very near future. And DNA CPR is part of end-of-life planning in very particular circumstances. So groups of young people in a service for people living with a learning disability or with a physical disability, it would be astonishing. So only in very particular circumstances. So we were concerned. We were very happy to be part of the statement on it and to do the further work to review it.
You say that you heard evidence from people, their families and carers, that there had been blanket DNA CPR decisions in place. Was it the case that the CQC not only heard that from people and their families, but actually saw the documentary evidence in the form of letters about DNA CPR? I
certainly heard of a lot, but in terms of documentary evidence, I'd have to check and come back to you. I haven't got that level of detail, I'm sorry.
Well, I think the the final review report itself gives one example of letters from a GP to care homes. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, that would be right, yes.
Did the CQC see other examples of that?
I couldn't say whether we did or not. I'd have to check and come back. I certainly recall anecdotes, inspectors talking about what they'd heard and seen, but I don't have the confirmed detail for you.
So going back to the CQC's conclusion that there was undoubtedly confusion and a sense that some providers felt under pressure, does that to some extent downplay the reality that DNA CPR decisions were proposed and were in fact put in place without consultation or discussion, including for people with learning disabilities?
So there is no doubt that blanket bans are never acceptable, and then the issue shifted as time went on. So blanket bans hopefully out of the way. Every care provider written to, every GP written to, really clear position. Then our concern was the increase in the number of individual orders, which it led to us being commissioned to do the work and led to the report. So these are not either for groups of people or individuals, not to be taken lightly. They should be, although ultimately a sort of clinical decision, should be done ideally with the involvement of the person, with their families, and with the involvement of care homes. It's not a care home decision, but as a provider of care, would expect to be in that general discussion about planning and what an individual wants and how to best respect their wishes.
Ms. Critch, I think you've made that distinction in your evidence already between the blanket and the individual. If I can just probe that a little bit, I mean, is it really the case that the problem with the blanket instruction is precisely that it might lead to those individual instances, and so therefore that was a concern from the very outset?
It's a breach of human rights. As you know, it's an offence against the Equality Act for groups of people to be subject to a do not resuscitate order is unacceptable. Absolutely.
What were the data sources that the CQC was able to use to determine the existence or the extent of any blanket approach to DNA CPR at that local or group level?
I think the intelligence came in from a variety of sources. Certainly the department had it. I don't know if it's detailed in our report. I'm afraid I couldn't speak to exactly what the different sources were. I imagine it would be a combination of what we heard from care providers themselves, from Give Feedback on Care, from the many, as I've said earlier, 2.5 million contacts over the course of the pandemic. So from people working in services, from families, from people themselves. So there would have been more than one source. If you'd like more information on that, we can get that for you.
I mean, I think that's in the form of sort of intelligence and survey sources, if I can put it that way. But in terms of actually the CQC reaching its conclusion about whether there had been inappropriate DNA CPRs on a widespread basis in individual cases, were there limitations on the data sources that the CQC was able to use?
I think the data sources we did use are described in the final report that we did. I don't know what to add to that. I'm sorry.
And so if that indicates that there was an in-depth review of 7 people's care records from a sample of the 166 records, would that be the kind of concrete material that the CQC was able to look at?
I think that was one element. I think there was... I think there were a form of inspection from. I'm sorry. This is feeling like a memory test. There were interviews. There was documentation looked at. We retrospectively retraced a number of orders. I think that's in the report.
And I mean, did the CQC reach any view as to whether record keeping could be improved in that respect, either through the use of electronic records rather than paper records so that such analysis would be easier? Or was that not part of the review?
I'm afraid I'm not over that level of detail. I think it probably is in the report. As a general rule, it would be the quality of record keeping is absolutely critical to all decisions about care, to understand who was involved, the circumstances in which key decisions like that are taken, and a really good decision won't stand as a good decision unless it's clearly documented. So it probably was, but I'm afraid without it in front of me, I couldn't comment further.
And I mean, does the CQC know today if there are still sort of inappropriate, discriminatory or unlawful DNA CPR notices in place on the records of people with learning disabilities that have been there since the pandemic?
We're moving beyond the pandemic, Ms Beattie. You're also running out of time, so if you want to ask any of the other questions that I've allowed, I suggest you move on.
I'm grateful, my lady. One other topic, Ms Cridge, which is about inspections and specifically what inspections learned about staff movement. In November 2021, the Adult Social Care in England Winter Plan, and I appreciate that's not a CQC document, but the government, the DHSC's Winter Plan said that where the CQC had received credible COVID-19 related concerns, such as in regard to staff movement or poor IPC practice, its default position was to trigger an inspection.
That's right.
And so my question is, what was the nature of the concerns in regard to staff movement that triggered inspections by the CQC?
Well, staff, I think there is an element in my statement that talks about the movement of staff between services. There would be questions about IPC and the protocol of that. Generally, at the time of lockdown, not moving between services would reduce risk, but the nature of employment in the sector is that there are people who pre-pandemic worked in more than one service, and there's also the situation where providers with more than one care home might want to move staff from one place to another. I think it's dealt with in the statement. The mantra would always be doing it safely, and it may well be there was a time when we said not, but I'd have to check that.
Thank you very much, Ms Beattie. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I think that completes the questions for you now. Thank you very much for your help. And I suspect the colleagues at the Care Quality Commission who helped provide the nearly 300-page statement. So please thank them for their help too. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Mr Beach.
Yes, thank you, my lady. Where we're approaching lunch, but I think there's some time we could usefully use to start the RQIA with us, Miss Donaghy.
Thank you. Pick your own moment when you wish to break, Mr Beach.
Very much obliged. Yes, may we please call Miss Donaghy?
Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat. Thank you.
Hope we haven't kept you waiting too long.
Not at all. Thank you, my lady.
Good afternoon, Miss Donaghy. I'm going to ask you some questions primarily arising out of your witness statement, which is dated the 18th of March 2025. At the outset, can I say that then you have been the Chief Executive of the Regulation and Quality Improvement Authority, or RQIA, since July 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And prior to that, you were in a senior role within Northern Health and Social Care Trust in Northern Ireland.
Correct.
Okay. I flagged that just by way of context. So while you weren't in position, but perhaps whenever some of the key decisions were taken, you have taken steps ahead of today to be well informed. Isn't that right?
Yes, milady, I have. I've spoken extensively to staff of the RQIA who were present at the time of the peak of the pandemic. I have listened to testaments of others, including bereaved families and others. I've read extensively. I've engaged with the authority members, and I believe I'm prepared to answer from an organisational perspective.
Thank you. In terms of the RQIA then, it is Northern Ireland's independent health and social care regulator. It's obviously independent of the Department of Health, but legislation does give the department the ability to direct the RQIA to take certain actions. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And just if you could enlighten me, whenever the department makes a direction, is there any discretion on the part of the RQIA, or are they bound to go along with what the department
No,
directs?
we're compelled to go along with it, although of course, milady, would have to be within the scope of our remit and role. So yes, and I should say it would not be a regular occurrence, but certainly under the founding legislation of RQIA, the reference Article 6 would enable the Department of Health to direct RQIA to carry out functions or exercise of its duties, yes.
We're primarily interested today then in the RQIA's regulatory function. And at risk of oversimplifying it, is it correct that it can be broken down into registration, inspection, and then enforcement, if that's not too crude a division?
And well, as you say, it's a danger of oversimplifying. So I just, yes, broadly. However, I would just remark that the Regulation and Quality Improvement Authority covers all those aspects. Part of our role is quality improvement. And now much of the time, of course, we exercise that role through a regulatory function. But we also have a supporting function. These are not in conflict with each other. Indeed, originally when RQA was established, I recall colleagues telling me it was referred to as the Quality Improvement and Regulation. So there is an aspect of our role that goes beyond registration, inspection and enforcement. We also provide support, advice, guidance, and we have a very specific and different role in the health and social care system in Northern Ireland under the trusts. But I know today we're concentrating on registered services.
And just very briefly, perhaps, why is it important that the RQIA performs that regulatory function?
Well, clearly regulation, I think, is an underpinning principle of all good service delivery, particularly independent regulation. In Northern Ireland, the registered sector, I mean, we're a small organisation, and under our legislation, there are a range of services required to register with us, largely from independent sector provision, but not exclusively so. Without that independent oversight, both in terms of registration, I would argue, because you're maintaining from the outset of an organisation being established that it is fit for purpose, that it has effective governance and oversight arrangements. But independent sector organisations, including care homes, for example, would not have the substantial governance arrangements that NHS, as might be thought of here, and HSC, we refer to it in Northern Ireland, does not have those governance arrangements. So we provide an independent oversight, quite detailed level of scrutiny, to be able to provide assurance to the Department of Health about the quality of those services and the provision of those services, and to the public and others who are commissioning those services. So it's a vital part of quality assurance and improvement.
Thank you. And just for the purposes then of this module, both residential nursing homes with and without care homes with and without nursing care and domiciliary agencies fall within RQIA's remit. Is that
yes, sir, and maybe very quickly, I know time is pressing, there are 470 care homes registered with RQIA. About 250 of those would be nursing, 220 roughly residential. And just to say briefly, I appreciate the time pressure. Domiciliary care is quite unusual in that we have 300 services registered with us, but 100 of those are what I think most people would consider to be traditional domiciliary care, providing services in people's own home, in the country, in the town, in the wherever. But there are 200 of those services that are registered with us for supported living facilities. This is quite unique and quite specific.
Thank you, Ms Donaghy. As you do know, time is pressing, and I'm keen to just explore a couple of issues with you. And perhaps if before the break we could explore the circumstances that the RQIA found itself in March 2020. Now, I am aware there has been an independent report into this, the Nicol review, if I could call it that today. But at page 14 of your witness statement, in paragraph 46, you set out that a number of, in effect, what I'd call the executive team were redeployed from RQIA. The chief executive ended up at the Public Health Agency, the head of business support, the director of improvement, and the medical director all ended up at the Department of Health. I suppose what I'm interested in is not perhaps the rights or wrongs of that for today, but what impact did those redeployments have on RQA's ability to regulate and to deal with the pandemic in March 2020?
As I believe I said in my statement, I think quite significant impact. Briefly to explain, RQIA is a small organisation at the time, and not much different since, about 130 of us in totality. The senior management team at that time would have been the chief executive, 2 directors and a head of business services. There were also 2 deputy directors in the structure. Looking to those 4 critical posts, chief executive, 2 directors, 1 head of business service, 3 of those staff were redeployed as you've described. Chief executive, a director, and business services. That left 1 director who, I would add, was very new to the post, had moved into that director's position maybe 6 months previously. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume here's an organisation facing into a pandemic with an interim chief executive, very inexperienced, who worked very hard, do not get me wrong, but coming into that situation with no directors reporting to him, 1 deputy director remaining. A new organisational structure had to be devised very quickly.
And just sorry if I may, turning that almost the impact then on
yes,
the
I will
adult social care sector.
very quickly explain. In the time of crises, I would suggest, and I've worked in the health system in Northern Ireland for a very long time, I would suggest at the time of crises, you need your most experienced, your most senior individuals, experienced processes and procedures, clarity of understanding of roles, all of that, much of that, was gone. The organisation worked very quickly to reorganise itself and begin to take decisions about operational practice. But one of the most fundamental aspects that were missing, well, the experience obviously, the regular processes of governance were missing, and the challenge and oversight of decision making was not what it should have been.
And then there was a second issue which occurred a couple of months later then. So on the 18th of June 2020, all the members of what's called the authority, which is perhaps the board of the RQIA, if that's a fair description, resigned en masse. In terms of the impact of that, at paragraph 66 of your statement, you said that this meant the RQIA did not have the full complement of strategic leadership and oversight required to effectively manage the organisation's normal business. Again, I'd be very interested in your reflections on how that impacted on the regulation of the adult social care sector. I understand it was operationally very difficult at a high level, but what about the impact on the adult social care sector?
Mm-hmm. The 2 events that you describe are clearly linked. It exposed the loss of the senior officers, exposed very possibly long-standing issues of lack of clarity on process and procedure. The standing down of the authority members in the June was, I have to be honest with you, it was shocking. I mean, it's in the height of a pandemic to be facing into such organisational issues is just, I mean, it would not be welcome at any time, but it was particularly difficult at that time. Although we say the others raised the loss of the other senior officers, you know, raised issues of operational practice, the lack of governance in place through the board, as you describe, or authority, as we say, meant those decisions, what were considered to be operational decisions, were not subject to challenge or scrutiny. It was in my view, and I think the view of the Nicol report, as you refer to, that many of those decisions were not operational. There were policy decisions. There were issues that should have been, you know, discussed at the highest level of the organisation because they changed the fundamental practice of the organisation. So that means those decisions were made and effected without effective scrutiny and oversight, and that it may not have made any difference to those decisions. It certainly implied in some of the emails sent by some of the members that they didn't dispute the decisions in themselves, but they did dispute the process. But I would argue that there was a lack of scrutiny and challenge and rigour, and that brings with it, you know, concerns and difficulties.
And those concerns and difficulties, did they impact on RQIA's ability to discharge its statutory function in March and in June 2020?
Well, they allowed decision making at an organisational, operational level to persist without scrutiny. Does that affect decision making? Does it affect delivery? I believe so. Otherwise, I'd be concluding that effective governance and scrutiny and oversight is not a requirement of, and you make the remarks, sir, particularly about the delivery of services to vulnerable adults in social care settings. I would argue it's essential to have effective scrutiny and effective oversight and decision making and challenge.
Perhaps just maybe before we finish this point and perhaps then go to a break, the Nicol report found that the crisis could not have happened if the department and the RQIA had the basics of good governance in place, clear rules, well-established and functioning relationships. You do set out in your statement that intensive work has been undertaken, but at date there still is not the required or recommended partnership agreement in place between the department and the RQIA. Is that work any further advanced at today's date?
Well, I'm pleased to advise that it is. And indeed, at the end of last week, myself and the authority chair signed off the partnership agreement, and it's currently with the Department of Health for counter signature. I would say it has taken us a considerable time to get to this point. The Nicol report and all of that, we're talking, 4 years ago? And set out in the minister who commissioned that report at the time, I think it was thought that the RQIA would be the vanguard of these new partnership arrangements and leading and perhaps signing way beyond others might have, and yet others have adopted partnerships agreements in advance of us. I think it demonstrates the level of anxiety on both the Department of Health and us in RQIA to ensure that what occurred reported under the Nicol report will never recur. And we have taken the time to ensure we understand our roles, responsibilities, and how we will engage effectively with each other. And that's been worth, I think, spending that bit of additional time on.
Thank you. Milady, that's the last of my governance type questions. I don't know if now is an appropriate time.
Certainly. I'm sorry we can't finish you before lunch, but we'll definitely finish you for this afternoon. I shall return at 2:05.
All rise.